So the gastric pits of the stomach, make sure you go through these cells and understand what the chief cells do, the parietal cells, the G cells, which secretes gastrin, which is a hormone for stimulation of contraction and secretion, and the neck and mucosal cells. So this goes through that. Now, the parietal cells, it's kind of important to understand how they produce hydrochloric acid because we have gone through this, and also why certain medications work. So obviously Tums is bicarbonate, it's calcium bicarbonate. And so that's a straight base. So if you have too much acid being produced in the parietal cells into the lumen of the stomach or the inside of the stomach, if you just eat some base like calcium bicarbonate or sodium bicarbonate, it kind of neutralizes the acid. But the way this acid is formed, it's what happens is you have carbon dioxide and water forming carbonic acid. So carbonic anhydrase is the enzyme, forms carbonic acid, then it dissociates into a proton and bicarbonate. And bicarbonate's an anion, and so there's this anion swap with chloride. So chloride goes into the parietal cell and bicarb leaves into the bloodstream. Now you have chloride building up, and so you have a concentration gradient of chloride and building up inside the parietal cell, and then it will go through the little channel into the lumen of the stomach down the concentration gradient. So chloride's kind of a passive process. But protons are actively transported. And so this is active transport of protons. So protons are pumped into the lumen of the stomach. So active transport with the use of a proton pump. And instead of it being like a sodium potassium pump that you've learned about in the past, this is a proton potassium pump. So it's pumping potassium in and protons out. And so when protons and chloride both get transported in the lumen of the stomach, they just are going to form an ionic bond, and that forms hydrochloric acid. So one way that medications decrease the amount of stomach acid being produced is a proton pump inhibitor. So it would inhibit active transport, therefore you're not transporting protons and you don't get hydrochloric acid. So those are drugs like Prilosec, Nexium, they're called proton pump inhibitors. Also certain medications like Benadryl, they can also kind of inhibit protons being pumped. And so antihistamines, Benadryl is an antihistamine. Acid secretion. So when you're secreting hydrochloric acid, it stimulates the parasympathetic nervous system. It stimulates the release of gastrin and histamine. Pepsinogen secretion is regulated by parasympathetic, by gastrin, and by histamine as well. So these things are stimulating digestion in the stomach. Sight, smell, taste of food, chewing and swallowing. This is the celiac phase, cephalic phase, being your head, right? So the cephalon is your head. And it's going to stimulate acid and pepsinogen secretion in the stomach by seeing food, tasting, smelling, chewing, and swallowing. And this activates the parasympathetic nervous system. Should go down arrow, which then stimulates gastrin secretion, which then starts to stimulate the release of hydrochloric acid and pepsinogen from the parietal and chief cells, and also stimulate smooth muscle contraction of the stomach. And so you get digestion in the stomach. Things that inhibit secretion. So if you have too much acidity, it can inhibit gastrin being released, or if the food exits into the duodenum. And if the food exits the stomach into the duodenum, that decreases the osmolarity in the stomach and decreases all these things, which then inhibits more secretion. Again, gastritis is an inflammation, anything that kind of irritates the mucosal lining in the stomach. We call gastritis. An ulcer, though, is an erosion of the stomach wall, and it's generally caused by a bacteria named H. pylori, which is acid resistance and destroys the mucosal layer. So once the food goes from the stomach into the duodenum or duodenum of the small intestines, this is where bile enters, and so bile is going to enter, and pancreatic enzymes and buffers. And so there is a common area here called the ampulla of Vater. The ampulla of Vater is where the common bile duct is bringing bile from the gallbladder and liver, and the pancreatic duct is delivering pancreatic enzymes and buffers all into the duodenum or duodenum of the small intestine. There's a little sphincter muscle called the sphincter of Oddi that releases the bile and the pancreatic enzymes and buffers. It's important to understand the liver produces bile. Liver cells or hepatocytes produce bile. And there are these bile ducts that all merge and eventually become one duct called the common hepatic duct. The gallbladder has the cystic duct. And so this right here is the cystic duct. And the cystic duct merges with the common hepatic duct to become the common bile duct. So you can get rid of your gallbladder. You still have the common bile duct hooked up to have bile enter the small intestine. Now, the pancreatic buffers are this bicarbonate-rich solution that neutralizes the acid in the chyme from the hydrochloric acid and brings the pH back up. In addition, there's digestive enzymes. Bile, on the other hand, is really a salt. It's a bile salt, and it basically breaks up fat molecules. So it's breaking up fat molecules. And it's important to understand the liver has well over 200 functions. And so it's getting nutrient-rich blood from the mesenteric veins. It's absorbing all the nutrients and vitamins, minerals, things you want and don't want from the intestines. And it's sending that nutrient-rich blood through the liver via the hepatic portal vein. And so you have the hepatic artery coming in, but you have the hepatic portal vein going in. And so the liver is said to detoxify substance and process certain nutrients and store minerals and help with a lot of different metabolic functions. It stores carbohydrates and makes lipids or lipoproteins. And so going through and understanding, again, the hepatic portal system is important. If you look at the liver, you have these hepatocytes all arranged, and you have in every corner, they're kind of a hexagonal shape. In every corner, you have a bile duct. So these cells are making bile, and it's going into the bile duct. And then you have the portal vein sending nutrient-rich blood through these cells. You have fresh blood from the aorta feeding these cells so they can stay alive and have their own nutrients. But all of those bile ducts in this portal triad in every corner are going to merge and eventually become the common hepatic duct. If you have this PowerPoint in display mode, you can click on this link and it gives you a video on all the functions of the liver if you are curious to go through those. We're going to talk about secreting bile, but it also processes nutrients, stores glycogen, which is stored glucose for the cells of the body. It can make triglycerides and It can make triglycerides. It can synthesize cholesterol, make cholesterol for cell membranes. It makes lipoproteins, creates fatty acids. And so here again, if you're in display mode, there's another video link if you want to watch a video on the liver. It also removes old red blood cells. It kind of stores hemoglobin, generates bilirubin, eliminates waste toxins. Bilirubin is then sent in the bile and is part of the bile salts. Synthesis of plasma proteins for osmotic pressure, and on and on and on. So a lot of jobs of the liver. Is this showing you a hepatic portal or hepatic triad? The liver is your hepatic organ. Hepatitis is inflammation. Hep A and Hep B are acute infections, which means your immune system can clear them. Hep C, though, is more chronic and harder to get rid of. And so that's why it can damage the hepatocytes and cause cirrhosis. Cirrhosis is anything that has chronic inflammation in the liver. Those hepatocytes are then replaced with scar tissue, and the portal blood can't filter through scar tissue that's replaced healthy hepatocytes or liver cells. And so blood kind of backs up in the portal vein, and that's what we call portal hypertension. Okay, the pancreas. So only 1% is the pancreatic islets that are producing insulin and glucagon, and those are hormones. And we've gone through those. So insulin is a hormone that promotes glucose storage or delivery into cells. And glucagon is a hormone that stimulates the liver to release stored glucose. It's stored as glycogen, and it just breaks down that glycogen and releases glucose. So if your blood sugar's low, glucagon gets released. If your blood sugar's high, insulin gets released. The other 99% of the pancreatic cells are secreting pancreatic juices and pancreatic enzymes. And so these are the acinar cells. They secrete the enzymes, the proteases, lipases, and amylases. And the duct cells are secreting this bicarbonate-rich fluid. And all these ducts eventually merge into the pancreatic duct, and this is delivered into the duodenum or duodenum of the small intestine. So pancreatic juice, very basic to help neutralize the hydrochloric acid in the chyme. Enzymes, amylases again, break down carbohydrates. Lipases break down fats. Proteases break down proteins. And then you have nucleases. Nucleases are secreted in active form, but require ions or bile to activate them. And these would be for nucleic acids. So pancreatic juice also has a hormone, CCK and secretin. And these hormones stimulate pancreatic secretions. The enzymes and bicarbonates are secreted independently. And so it's going to be dependent on what is in the actual chyme. So CCK stimulates the acinar cells to secrete the enzymes. Secretin stimulates the secretion of bicarbonate. So fat and amino acids entering the duodenum or duodenum is going to release CCK. And remember, CCK stimulates enzymes. The acid in the chyme is going to stimulate secretin, and that thus stimulates the release of bicarbonate. So however much acid is entering it's going to stimulate secretin to kind of counteract that acid with the bicarb. CCK also stimulates the gallbladder and liver to secrete bile. And stimulate gallbladder contractions and relaxation of the sphincter odi, so bile and pancreatic juices can go in. And so again, you have the duodenum. It's retroperitoneal, but then it kind of pokes forward and becomes the jejunum and ileum. This is where all the absorption is going on of nutrients, and then eventually the small intestines become larger, and we call it the colon. So intestinal juices are secreted in response to distension or irritation. And these juices are going to facilitate transport and absorption of nutrients. So that's different than the bicarbonate and the enzymes. And so once chyme enters the small intestine, the duodenum or duodenum, it distends it or irritates the mucus, and basically it's going to then facilitate intestinal juices to be secreted. And that helps move things through the small intestine. Most of the absorption of nutrients and substances are within the first 20 feet of the intestines, but the more fiber and the harder it is to extract the nutrients away from the undigestible foods that we don't have enzymes for, the longer it stays in your intestines before getting absorbed. The intestinal crypts, this is where that bicarbonate-rich fluid gets secreted from. And by the way, gets secreted in the proximal and reabsorbed in the distal end. And so this is kind of showing you these intestinal crypts here with its own enteroendocrine cells for CCK and secretin. There's some lymphatic vessels. So the green are lymphatic vessels along with mesenteric capillaries here, the blue and red. The absorptive cells with these microvilli and brush border enzymes are here. Goblet cells help produce mucus as well. Mucosal associated lymphatic tissue is lymphatic. It's part of your immune system. So again, you have segmentation and peristalsis through the small intestines. Increased distension helps increase motility. Parasympathetic nervous system will excite things moving through the small intestines, as well as gastrin stimulates smooth muscle as well. Once the substance enters from the ileum of the small intestine into the large intestine, the first portion is called the cecum here, and the appendix hangs off the cecum. It's really a matter of concentrating the waste. So there's really absorption of water out of what was not absorbed into your body, and you compact it, concentrate it, store it, and then get rid of it, which is defecation. So the purpose of the large intestine is really to empty what you didn't absorb. They have these little haustra, these little kind of segments called haustra, and it gets mixed and compacted and then massed moved through the colon. So the presence of food in the stomach is going to activate mass movement in the colon. And so it gets activated 3-4 big waves per day. And so the bolus kind of moves up and then over and then down and then around. And so that's what we refer to as mass movement. So you can read through the defecation and the way it works with the nervous system. A diverticula is a small outpouching of the colon wall, a herniation. So instead of it being like this, it's like that. It just gets stretched out. Diarrhea, by the way, is any condition that nutrients are not being absorbed, and so water stays with the non-absorbed nutrients. These nutrients then are not sufficiently absorbed. Constipation would be anything that you have too much water absorbed because all of the nutrients went into your bloodstream, and so there's very little remains, and so it stays compacted and doesn't move very much. Okay, I'm going to continue the next part in part 2 of chapter 20. So you'll have to watch part 2 of chapter 20.